In the spring of 2009, a man named Dale Hoffer stood in the gravel lot behind a shuttered farm equipment auction outside Cedar County, Nebraska, and listened to a younger appraiser tell a small crowd why the heavy black thing on the pallet in front of them was worth nothing. The appraiser was 34, sharp in a pressed shirt with a University Extension logo stitched over the pocket, and he had a tablet in his hand with a depreciation schedule open on the screen. He tapped the anvil with the toe of a clean boot that had never been near a forge. "Scrap," he said, and not even good scrap, because the face was chipped and the horn was worn round, and somebody had welded a bad repair across the heel 40 years ago. He said it kindly, the way a man explains arithmetic to a child. $250 somebody had pinned to it as a reserve, and the appraiser smiled at that number like it was a joke told by a sentimental old fool. 14 years later, in the fall of 2023, a knife maker from the Black Hills of South Dakota drove 11 hours through 2 states and a snow squall to stand in front of that same anvil. And when he was done examining it, he wrote a check without arguing about the price. And the number on that check made a room full of people who thought they understood value go very quiet. Let me tell you about the span between those 2 days, because it is a story about 2 kinds of knowing, and about 160 pounds of wrought iron that the modern eye could not read, and about a man who had spent his whole life learning to read exactly that. Dale Hoffer was 61 that spring, and he was known in his county for 2 things. He was known for never raising his voice, and he was known for being able to tell you, by sound alone, whether a piece of old iron was sound or rotten clear through. He had a small place on the Bow Creek bottom, 90 acres of it, where he kept a few cattle and a garden and a low shop with a dirt floor that his grandfather had built in 1931. He drove a 1986 Ford that started every morning. He wore the same canvas coat he had worn for 20 years. To the appraiser standing in the auction lot, Dale was exactly what he appeared to be, an old man in a worn coat who did not understand that the world had moved on from anvils. He was not a bad man, that appraiser. His name was Brett Coyle, and he genuinely believed what he was saying. He had a degree in agricultural economics and 4 years of teaching farmers how to read commodity markets. And he had been trained to see the world as a spreadsheet where everything had a depreciation curve and a salvage value and a useful life. An anvil to Brett was a tool that modern manufacturing had made obsolete, and a chipped one was a liability you paid to haul away. He was not wrong about most of what he believed. He was only wrong about this, and he was wrong in a way that would take 14 years and a structural collapse in the antique tool market to make plain. What Brett could not see, standing there in his clean boots, was what the iron was. Let me tell you about anvils, because the whole story turns on a thing most people never learn. An anvil is not one piece of metal. The old ones, the good ones, were made of a wrought iron body with a hardened steel plate forge welded across the top. The working face. Wrought iron is not the cast iron of a cheap doorstop. It is iron with thin threads of glassy slag worked all through it, fibrous like the grain in a board. And that structure is why a good wrought anvil rings like a bell and returns the energy of a hammer blow back up into the work, instead of swallowing it dead. The chip in the face that Brett had pointed at was on the heel, away from the sweet spot. The worn round horn was worn from use, not damage, and the bad weld across the heel was not a repair of a crack. Dale had crouched down and run his thumb along it and known in about 4 seconds that it was an old maker's attempt to add a clip horn, abandoned, and ground back. The body underneath was whole. Dale did not say any of that out loud in the lot. He had learned a long time ago that explaining iron to a man with a tablet was like explaining color to someone determined to measure everything in pounds. He stood in the back of the small crowd with his hands in his coat pockets, and he waited. A retired auctioneer named Hollis ran the sale that day, working through a long line of pallets, dead tractors, and barrels of bolts. And when the crowd thinned around the heavy black thing on the pallet, Brett Coyle saw a teaching moment and took it. He gathered 3 or 4 younger farmers around and walked them through the depreciation logic on his screen. The original cost, the useful life, the salvage. He turned the tablet so they could see the curve drop to nothing. This, he said, tapping the screen and then the cold iron, is what we mean when we say a tool is past its economic life. He was good at it. The young men nodded. One of them, a kid in a feed store cap, asked what you would even do with an anvil, and Brett smiled and said exactly, which was the whole point. When the auction reached the pallet, and the bidding opened and died at the reserve with nobody willing to take it at $250, Hollis looked around for a hand, and Dale raised one finger. He paid the reserve. But Brett watched him load it into the bed of the old Ford with a come-along and a plank, and he came over and helped lift, because he was not the kind of man to watch a 61-year-old strain at iron alone, and that detail matters too, that the man who could not read the anvil had a decent heart. When it was settled in the truck bed, Brett brushed the rust off his hands and shook his head, and he said to the woman beside him, "That is exactly the kind of sentiment that keeps these old fellows poor." He meant it as a sad thing, not a cruel one. That is important. He pitied Dale, and he drove home that evening to his apartment in town, feeling, in a small way, that he had done the old man a kindness by being honest about the iron. If you have ever watched someone confident explain away something you understood in your hands, you know the particular quiet that Dale carried out of that lot. Tell me in the comments whether you have stood where he stood. Then let me get back to the iron, because the iron is where this goes. The knowledge Dale carried had not come from nowhere. It had come from his grandfather, Otto Hoffer, who had crossed from a village in the old country in 1907, with a chest of hand tools and a way of seeing metal that he had learned from his own father, who had been a village smith. Otto built the Bow Creek shop in 1931, and he kept on a shelf above the workbench a black ledger book with a cracked leather cover, in which he wrote down, in 2 languages and a tight slanting hand, everything he learned about the iron and steel that passed through his hands. Which makers rang true, which steel held an edge, and which went soft. How to test a weld by sound and by the color it threw under the file. Dale had grown up at that bench. By the time he was 12, he could close his eyes and tell a cast anvil from a wrought one by the note it gave when his grandfather tapped it with a ball peen. The ledger was his inheritance more than the 90 acres, though the county assessor would never have written it that way. There was a dog in those years, a stock dog named Pete, a blue heeler going gray at the muzzle, who followed Dale from the house to the shop every morning and lay in the doorway where the light came in. Pete was there the spring Dale brought the anvil home. He sniffed the black iron once and lay back down in the doorway, unimpressed. And that was the right response, because for a long time nothing happened. The anvil sat on a stump in a corner of the shop, and Dale used it the way you use a good tool, quietly, daily, for 14 years, while the world outside argued about what things were worth. Let me tell you about the man who would eventually drive 11 hours to find it, though in 2009 neither of them knew the other existed. His name was Cole Reyes, and in 2009 he was 19, and just starting to learn to forge knives in a borrowed garage in the Black Hills. The thing about forging a blade is that the anvil is not a passive table. The smith works hot steel against the face hundreds of times for every knife, and a dead-faced anvil, one that swallows the blow, costs the smith energy on every single strike, and across a career, cost him his shoulders and his elbows. A live face, a wrought face, that returns the energy, is the difference between a craft a man can do at 50 and a craft that breaks him at 40. There is a way smiths talk about this, a word they use: rebound, the percentage of a dropped ball bearing that bounces back up off the face. A dead anvil might give you half. A great wrought anvil with a full hardened plate will give you back 9/10 of the drop, and you feel that difference in your elbow on the 10,000th blow of a long day. Cole did not know any of that yet. He was learning it the hard way on a cheap cast anvil that rang dead and gave back almost nothing, and his arm hurt every night, and the knives he made came out heavy and slow because the tool fought him the whole way. He had an old man teach him the basics. That first year, a retired farrier who came around the borrowed garage on Sundays and watched Cole hammer and said little. One Sunday, the farrier brought his own anvil out of his truck, a small, unremarkable thing, and set it on the stump, and told Cole to forge the same simple hook on it that he had been struggling with on the cast one. Cole did, and the work seemed to leap up under the hammer, the steel moving like it wanted to, and he finished the hook in half the strikes and looked up with his mouth open. "That," the farrier said, "is what you are looking for, and you will spend 10 years looking for it, and you will not find it in a store." Then he loaded his anvil back into his truck and drove off, because it was the only one he had, and he was not about to part with it. Cole never forgot the lesson or the ache of wanting the tool. He understood from that day that the difference between iron and iron was real and measurable and almost invisible to anyone standing outside the work. Across the same years, there was a neighbor of Dale's on the Bow Creek bottom, a good man named Wade Stroud, who had taken the other path. And I want you to hold Wade in your mind with sympathy rather than scorn, because Wade did everything the experts told him to do. Wade was Dale's age, and he farmed 3,000 acres of corn on credit and confidence. In 2012, he borrowed against everything to buy a self-propelled sprayer, the color of a fire engine that cost more than Dale's entire farm. And he stood beside it in his yard and told Dale that the future belonged to scale, and that Dale was farming a museum. Wade was not mocking him. Wade was worried about him, the way you worry about a brother who will not change scale or die, Wade said. That was the second time the word for what Dale did got spoken out loud as a kind of sickness, the first having been Brett's word sentiment. By 2015, Wade was the most prosperous-looking man in the township, and Dale was the same as he had always been. Wade's equipment line stretched along his shelter belt, like a parade, the sprayer, 2 big 4-wheel-drive tractors, a combine traded every other year, a grain setup with legs and bins that caught the evening light, like a small city. He hosted the county agronomist for field days and stood in the headlands explaining yield maps off a screen mounted in the cab. He had a number for everything: bushels per acre, dollars per bushel, the break-even line he needed corn to stay above, and in 2015 corn cooperated, and the numbers all came up green. He bought his wife a new truck. He put a metal roof on the house. Dale had a 1986 Ford and a dirt floor shop and a dog. To the bank, Wade was a balance sheet on an upward curve, and Dale was a rounding error. To the people who measured prosperity by what stood in a man's yard, the question of which one of them had chosen correctly was already settled, and it was not settled in Dale's favor. That is how these things always look at the point in the season before the weather turns. Dale's granddaughter came back to Bow Creek in the summer of 2016. Her name was Marin. She was 24. And she had a degree in finance from a good school and a job offer. In Omaha, she had not yet accepted. She had come to help her grandfather get his affairs in order, by which her mother meant convince him to sell the 90 acres and the shop full of old iron before he got too old to manage it. Marin loved her grandfather, and she was also embarrassed by him. By the worn coat and the dirt floor and the corner full of black anvils and the shelf of rusted hand tools that a salvage yard would not pay to take. She had been raised inside the same arithmetic as Brett Coyle. On her first evening home, she walked the shop with a notepad, putting numbers next to things, and when she got to the corner, she wrote, beside the heavy chipped anvil from the auction, the word junk and a dash, and then nothing because she could not think of a figure low enough to bother writing. Marin said it to his face on the second night, gently. The way you deliver a hard truth to someone you love. Grandpa, she said, this is all sentiment. You are sitting on land you could sell, and you are keeping a building full of scrap because it reminds you of Otto. That word again. Sentiment. The third time the dismissal would be spoken came later and from a different mouth, but Marin spoke it that night at the kitchen table under the single hanging bulb with the ledger sitting closed between them, and Dale did not argue. He opened the ledger to a page his grandfather had written in 1948, and he turned it toward her, and he said, "Read me that line." She read it. It was a note in 2 languages about the ring of a particular anvil, and the price a smith in Yankton had paid for it. She did not understand why he wanted her to read it. He closed the book. "Just remember you read it," he said. "Let me tell you what Dale actually did with that anvil across those years, because the work is the proof. He cleaned to forge on it himself, late in life. Not knives, but small repairs, hooks and hinges and the iron pieces a working farm always needs, and every time his hammer came down, the face threw the energy back up clean, and the whole shop rang with that bell note that meant the weld between the steel plate and the wrought body was still sound after 130 years. He kept it oiled. He kept the face clean. He never ground it flat to make it look new because he knew that grinding the face thin was how the ignorant kill the good anvil, taking off the hardened plate a careless 1/8 of an inch at a time, until the soft body showed through and the tool was dead forever. He understood that the value was in the steel plate that remained, measured in a thing nobody at the auction had thought to measure. He had measured it. In the back of the ledger in his own hand now, Dale had written the date he brought it home and the thickness of the hardened face plate at the sweet spot, gauged with a transfer punch and a depth rule, 3/8 of an inch of hardened steel, full and unground. That number meant nothing to anyone who did not forge. It would come to mean everything. Which brings us back to Wade, because by 2018, the parade in his yard had become a weight around his neck. He had bought into a model that assumed corn would stay above $4 and that credit would stay cheap, and he had optimized his whole operation, his word, optimized for maximum yield at maximum scale, planting the same hybrid fence to fence because the agronomist said uniformity was efficiency. Dale had watched him do it and had said only one thing, once, leaning on the fence between their places. "A field that is all one thing," Dale said, "is one bad year from being all one problem." Wade had laughed. He liked Dale. He thought Dale was a good man who was afraid of the future. Then came the drought of 2021, and after it, the thing nobody had a model for. The drought was bad enough on its own, the worst in 40 years across that part of Nebraska, And it burned Wade's uniform fields brown by the middle of July, while the diverse weedy edges of Dale's small place stayed green a little longer, in the way that mixed plantings always do, holding moisture in a way a single optimized hybrid never could. The drought was just the weather. The real shock came underneath it in the markets, where the long boom in farmland and farm credit that had carried men like Wade for a decade finally broke. Interest rates that had been near nothing for years climbed fast, and the cheap credit that Wade's whole model depended on turned expensive in a matter of months, and the land values he had borrowed against softened at the same time. The fragile, optimized, debt-financed thing came apart, exactly where Dale had said it would, at the seam where it assumed nothing would change. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy and wrong to enjoy this. W. Stroud was not a fool, and he was not punished for a sin. He was a hard-working man who had been told by every credentialed voice around him that scale and efficiency and debt were the path, and he had believed them, and the believing broke him. And by the fall of 2022, the fire engine sprayer and most of the parade had gone to auction, the same kind of auction where Dale had once bought an Anvil for $250. And Wade stood in his own yard while younger men in pressed shirts put depreciation numbers next to the machines he had given his life to. The sprayer that had cost him more than Dale's whole farm sold for a fraction of the note still owed on it. The big tractors went to a dealer 2 counties over. Wade watched the combine roll up onto a trailer and head down the road that his grandfather had graded by hand, and he did not say anything, because the words, "a man wants in that moment," do not come out whole. He lost the ground his family had farmed for 90 years. To the bank, it was a foreclosure file. To Wade, it was something else entirely, and Dale, who never gloated, drove over and sat with him on the tailgate of the old Ford and said nothing for a long time, because there was nothing to say that arithmetic. After a while, Wade spoke. "They told me," Wade said, and then he stopped, because there was no end to that sentence that helped. Dale just nodded, and the 2 old men watched the light go off the empty machine sheds and the third voicing of the dismissal. The one that mattered most was the one that did not come. Wade did not call Dale a museum that evening. He had stopped believing it. Marin was there for all of it. She had never taken the Omaha job. She had stayed first to help with the affairs, and then because something about the ledger had gotten into her, and across those years she had quietly become her grandfather's student without quite admitting it. The first crack in her certainty had come the day she watched Dale turn down a man from a scrap company who offered him $60 for a barrel of old hand tools, and then watched Dale sell 3 of those same tools to a timber framer from Minnesota, because the framer knew what a hand-forged slick and a corner chisel were worth, to a man who still cut joints by hand. Marin had a finance degree. She knew what arbitrage was. She had simply never been taught that it could live in a barrel of rust in the gap between what a thing is called and what it can do, and that the only capital required to capture it was knowing. She remembered the exact moment the floor of her certainty gave way. The timber framer, a quiet woman named Rue, with sawdust ground into the knees of her canvas pants, had picked up the slick and old wide chisel the length of her forearm, and she had held it flat to the window light and sighted down the back of it the way you sight down a rifle, checking that the steel was true. She had run a thumbnail across the edge. Crow. Then she had asked Dale a single question about who had forged it and how the steel was laid, and Dale had answered out of the ledger, and the 2 of them had talked for 10 minutes, in a language Marin did not speak, about laminated steel and water hardening, and the way a blade made before the war held an edge that nothing made after it could match. When Rue paid, she paid without flinching, and she thanked Dale as though he had done her a favor by letting her buy it. Marin had stood in the doorway with her notepad and felt, for the first time, that her notepad was the thing in the room that did not know anything. She started asking questions about the ledger. She started late at night reading Otto's Slanting Hand. Let me tell you how the knife maker found the anvil, because the chain of it matters. Cole Reyes had become, by 2023, one of the better-known makers of hard-use blades in the northern plains, and he had a problem that money could not directly solve. He had worn out 2 modern anvils and broken a third, because the new cast ones, even the expensive imported ones, did not have the wrought body and the forge-welded plate that returned the energy, and his work had grown to where he needed a great old anvil or he was going to ruin his arms before 50. He had been looking for 2 years, a good, unmolested wrought anvil with a full, hardened face, 150 pounds or better by a known maker, was not a thing you bought online. The ones that came up for sale had been ground flat by people who did not understand them, their faces thinned to nothing, their value destroyed by the very effort to make them look valuable. Cole had a standard, and the standard was unforgiving, and almost nothing met it. Marin found Cole, or found his need, in a forum thread late one night, a maker asking the question she now knew how to answer. She knew, because she had read the back of the ledger, that the anvil in the corner had a full 3/8 face unground, by a maker whose stamp Otto had recorded as one that rang true. She typed a careful message describing exactly what was in her grandfather's shop, the maker's mark, the weight, the unground face, the sound. She did not name a price. Cole read it at 1 in the morning and sat very still because he had learned to be suspicious of descriptions written by people who did not understand what they were describing, and this one understood. He called the number she had left. He asked her 3 questions, the kind of penetrating questions a qualified man asks to find out whether the person on the other end actually knows. Marin answered all 3 out of the ledger and out of 2 years at the bench beside her grandfather. There was a silence on the line. Then Cole said he would come, and he asked her not to sell it to anyone before he got there, and he hung up and started loading his truck. He drove 11 hours. He drove out of the Black Hills and across the width of Nebraska through a late spring snow squall that closed the interstate for an hour near Norfolk, and he pulled into the Bow Creek place in the gray light of a cold morning, and Dale met him at the shop door with Pete, old now and nearly blind. Cole did not look at the price. He did not look at the land or the worn coat or the dirt floor. He walked to the corner, and he crouched down in front of the black anvil the way Dale had crouched in front of it 14 years before, and he ran his thumb along the heel, and he took a small ball-peen hammer out of his coat, and he tapped the face once lightly near the sweet spot. The shop rang. It rang the way a struck bell rings. A clear high note that hung in the cold air for a full second, and then faded, and Cole closed his eyes while it faded, the way the qualified always listen with their eyes shut. He set the hammer down. He took out a small depth gauge, and he checked the faceplate himself, at the sweet spot, the way a man checks a thing he intends to bet his career on, and he read the same number Dale had written in the back of the ledger years before. He stood up. He looked at Dale and he looked at Marin, and he asked the only question that mattered, which was not how much, but a question that told them he already knew the answer to how much. How is it, he said, that nobody took this in 14 years? Marin started to answer, and Dale put a hand on her arm. Because nobody could hear it, Dale said. Cole nodded slowly. Then he named his own price, before they could name one. And he named it because he was the kind of man who would not steal a thing he had driven 11 hours to honor. He wrote the check at the workbench, under the single bulb, with the ledger open beside his hand, and he turned it around on the bench so they could see the figure and the number he had written for 160 pounds of iron that an appraiser had called not even good scrap was $9,400. $9,400. It is a strange thing what a number can do in a quiet room. It was not a fortune. Cole was not a rich man, and Dale would not have taken a fortune. It was simply the true price, the price a thing reaches when it finally meets the one person equipped to read it, and it landed in that cold shop with a weight all out of proportion to its size, because it was the answer to a 14-year argument that one side had not even known it was having. Marin looked at the check, and then at the anvil, and then at her grandfather, and she understood, finally and completely, that the entire span of her education had taught her to measure everything except the thing that had just been measured in front of her. $376 a pound. She did the arithmetic without meaning to. The corn Wade had bet his life on had sold in his best year for less than 5 cents a pound. Pete lay in the doorway through all of it, and when the check was written, the old dog got up and walked stiffly over and lay down again across Dale's boots, and Dale reached down without looking and put his hand on the gray muzzle, and that was the only celebration there was. Cole stayed for 2 hours. He did not load the anvil and run. He sat at the workbench, and he and Dale and Marin went through the ledger, page by page, and Cole asked about other anvils, other tools, and Dale told him which of the black shapes in the corner rang true, and which were cast and dead, and Cole bought 2 more, fairly, and left the rest, because a man who understands value does not strip a place bare. Before he left, he asked Marin a question. He asked her if she knew anyone else who could read iron the way her grandfather could, because makers like him were always looking and almost never finding, and the few people left who could tell a sound, wrought face from a ruined one were dying off faster than they were being made. Marin said she knew one. She meant herself, though she did not say it that plainly. That is where the recalibration came, and it did not come from Brett Coyle, who had moved on years before and never thought again about the old man and the lot. It came from Marin, the skeptic, who had written the word junk in her notepad 7 years earlier, and who now understood that she had been the appraiser too, that the dismissal had lived in her own hand. She did not say, "I was wrong" out loud, because the family did not talk that way. She did something better. The following spring, she turned down a second job offer, and she set up a small bench in the corner of the shop where the anvil had stood, and she began doing for a living the thing Cole had named, finding old hand tools and old iron at farm sales across 3 states, reading them with the ledger and her grandfather's ear, and selling them to the dwindling number of people equipped to know what they were. She was good at it. Her finance degree turned out to be useful after all, just not for the thing it had been bought for. She kept records like a banker, and she read iron like a smith, and the combination was rare enough that within 2 years makers and timber framers and restoration carpenters across the plains knew her name. Let me tell you what happened to the rest of it, because the spread is the part that matters most. As word moved, neighbors who had once pitied Dale started showing up at the Bow Creek shop with boxes of their own grandfather's tools, asking Marin and Dale to tell them what they had. Most of it was ordinary. Some of it was not. A widow from the next township brought a coffee can of old plain irons, and went home with the knowledge that 2 of them were worth more than her late husband's good rifle. A young couple restoring a barn brought a rusted broadaxe that turned out to be a cooper's tool, a museum in the East had been looking for. The Hoffers never bought a neighbor's tools cheap to resell high. They told people the truth about what they had and helped them sell it themselves, and they charged a small, honest fee for the knowing, and they taught at a bench in the shop on winter Saturdays anyone who wanted to learn to hear the difference between sound iron and rot. They started with the ball bearing and the rebound test, the same thing the farrier had shown Cole years before, dropping a steel ball on a face and watching how high it came back. And then they moved to the ear, to the bell note, because the ear was the older and the truer instrument, and the one a tablet could never carry. Wade Stroud came to one of those Saturdays the year after he lost his ground, and he sat in the back the way Dale had once stood in the back of the auction lot, and he learned to tap an anvil and listen, and something in his face eased a little. He had spent his life moving fast across a great deal of ground. He had never once stood still long enough to hear what a single object had to say. By the next spring, Wade was helping Marin load and haul, paid honestly for the work, and a man who had owned 3,000 acres found he did not mind owning a pickup and a good eye and a place to be useful. Dale never grew rich. He never wanted to, and he never used the word. The 90 acres stayed 90 acres. The 1986 Ford kept starting. The shop kept its dirt floor. The wealth that came through the Bow Creek place came in a form the assessor still had no column for, and most of it did not stay with Dale anyway because he turned it outward into Marin's bench and into the neighbors' boxes and into the winter Saturdays. The ledger filled up. When the cracked leather covers would hold no more, Marin bought a second book, and she began writing in it in her own hand in one language now instead of two, but in the same spirit, recording which makers rang true and which steel held and what she learned at every farm sale across 3 states. The chain that had started with a village smith in the old country and passed through Otto and through Dale did not end. It bent, and it found a new hand, and it kept going. There is a thing worth saying plainly now. At the end, the way Dale would never have said it himself. The modern world is very good at measuring what is easy to measure, and very bad at noticing what it cannot. It can tell you the weight of an anvil and the depreciation curve of a sprayer and the salvage value of a barrel of rust, and it will mistake those numbers for the truth about a thing, and most of the time it will get away with it, because most of the time nobody equipped to know any better is in the room. The appraiser was not lying when he said the anvil was scrap. He was telling the exact truth, as his instruments could read it. His instruments simply could not read the iron. There are 2 kinds of knowing in this world. One is wide and fast and confident, and can be written on a tablet, and it is genuinely useful, and it runs most of what we do. The other is narrow and slow and quiet, and lives in the hands and the ear, and a cracked leather book. And it cannot be scaled and cannot be rushed, and is dying out a little more every year as the people who carry it die out. The first kind built the parade in Wade Stroud's yard. The second kind heard the bell. What is rigid breaks, and what is rigid was sure of itself right up until the season it broke. What is patient and attentive and rooted in one piece of ground endures, not because it is sentimental, but because it knows things the spreadsheet was never built to hold. A man drove 11 hours through a snow squall for a $250 anvil because he had learned the hard way that the true worth of a thing and its listed price are 2 different numbers, and that the gap between them is exactly the size of what a person knows. The anvil rings in a shop in the Black Hills now, every working day, and somewhere in a drawer beneath the bench is a copy of 1 page from Otto Hoffer's ledger. The line Dale once made Marin read aloud at the kitchen table. Cole asked for it before he left, and Dale gave it to him, and that was the only thing in the whole exchange Dale gave away for free. Back on the Bow Creek bottom, the second ledger fills slowly in Marin's hand. The shop still has its dirt floor, and on the worn boards by the doorway, in the square of morning light where an old blue heeler used to lie, a young dog lies now, watching the road, waiting for whoever comes next, with a box of their grandfather's iron and a question about what it is worth. The honest answer is always the same. It is worth exactly what someone who can hear it will pay, and not 1 cent of what someone who cannot ever could.